Are there any redeeming qualities to a movie as bad as God's Not Dead? I remember watching it in theaters with friends in middle or early high school. While some parts of the movie were somewhat enjoyable, I recall being haunted by a sense of secondhand embarrassment while viewing the cheesier scenes, like the death of
Professor Radisson.
The secondhand embarrassment transitioned into firsthand embarrassment when I faced the call to action at the end of the flick. I wished to be anywhere else but at that theater at this point and a few others. Overall, my assessment was a strongly negative one. My experience is not unique. Many people have criticized God's Not Dead over the years and found it lacking. Some have argued that Christian movies generally lack artistry and creativity.
Jesus, man.
Josh Keefe has an insightful video essay on this topic, which is linked below. But even in a movie as discordant and awkward as God's Not Dead, I believe that there's a note that rings true. To show this, I'd like to present a concept which I'll call response appropriateness. My idea is that when faced with opposition in dialogue, there are different modes of conversation with which one may respond, and that some modes are more appropriate than others, given the context of the conversation. Imagine this scenario. A loved one comes to you and complains that you've said something that hurt their feelings. You're at liberty to respond in various ways, from empathetically engaging with their complaint to angrily dismissing it to arguing rationally that their complaint was misguided or mistaken in the first place. I contend that responding correctly in some way requires that you respond in the correct mode. For instance, the loved one's emotional appeal might be better met with an emotionally empathetic response rather than a cold, rational argument. In the same way, I believe that artistic or cultural works can respond to each other in more or less appropriate modes, and that God's Not Dead takes the correct mode of response. Well then, what is the movie responding to, and why do I think it's appropriate? From the title alone, it's easy to see that God's Not Dead is pushing back on the claim that God is dead, a statement famously made by Nietzsche in his work The Parable of the Madman. Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning hours, ran into the market and cried incessantly, "I seek God, I seek God." As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. Has he got lost? Asked one. Did he lose his way like a child? Asked another. Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone out on a voyage? Immigrated? Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. Whither is God? He cried, I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How did we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backwards, sidewards, forward, in all directions? Is there any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is night not continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the gravediggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? Gods too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead. And we have killed him. With this parable, Nietzsche is not arguing that God doesn't exist. There is no argument in the story at all. Instead, he is presenting a narrative through which we are meant to see that belief in God is untenable, and that the faith of the faithful is rotting away into nothing. Here, I believe the movie God's Not Dead does something right. It responds to Nietzsche's narrative appropriately with a counter-narrative rather than a counter-argument. Since our German philosopher presents his famous aphorism with a story rather than a logically rigorous argument, the best response would be an equally compelling but contradictory story. After all, it's not as if the madman is likely unaware of the various arguments for God's existence, such that he would convert upon hearing the evidence from contingency. Instead, the madman notices that, culturally speaking, God is fading out of the picture. What could be a better way to respond than to point out in story form all of the interesting and essential ways in which God has not faded out of culture, and how belief in him is not untenable to the masses, educated or otherwise. And this is what God's Not Dead attempts to do. Insofar as God's Not Dead responds to Nietzsche in like kind, narrative for counter-narrative, I believe that the movie launches its message in the correct mode. Unfortunately, I think it's safe to say that the narrative offered by God's Not Dead doesn't do religion any favors. While they may be in harmony, the two melodies sound out in vastly different ways. Whereas Nietzsche's story has tormented generations of Christendom with haunting nihilism, God's Not Dead just makes you want to kill yourself.
It just hits so freaking hard for no reason.
Yeah. It's good. It's good.
That's so silly.